On hanksgiving, all my relatives Ireated me toxically, called me names, criticized me, and mocked me. However, when I left them, they started outragedly posting on Reddit and talking about how bad of a daughter I am. I knew this year's Thanksgiving would be just like all the others, draining, judgmental, and filled with awkward silences that would somehow feel louder than the chatter. But this time, I promised myself things would be different. I'd set boundaries. I'd protect my peace. Spoiler alert, that plan didn't last. I arrived at my parents' house around noon, hoping to blend into the pre-dinner chaos unnoticed. No such luck. The second I stepped through the door, Aunt Sarah pounced. Well, look who decided to grace us with her presence. Still writing those articles, or whatever you call them, she said, with her patented combination of condescension and fake curiosity. For context, I'm a freelance journalist. Not a Pulitzer winner or anything, but I've built a solid career for myself. To her, though, I might as well be scribbling on napkins at a coffee shop. Yep, still writing, I replied curtly, hoping she'd move on. She didn't. You know, my neighbor's daughter just started medical school. Such a smart girl. Always said she wanted to make a real difference, Sarah continued, with a pointed glance at me. Real difference. Sure. Because reporting on corruption and social issues is just a hobby, I guess. Before I could escape, Uncle Tom waddled over, balancing a plate of deviled eggs. He didn't even bother with a hello. Emily, you've put on a few, haven't you? He said, nodding at my waistline like it was the weather. I froze for a moment, caught between shock and the desire to shove the entire plate of eggs into his face. Nice to see you too, Uncle Tom, I muttered, pushing past him and into the kitchen. The kitchen was no better. My mom, Julia, was in full Martha Stewart mode, barking orders at my younger cousins and obsessively rearranging the already perfect centerpiece. She barely glanced up when I walked in. Emily, grab the wine from the garage, will you? And can you try to look a little more put together before dinner? It's a holiday, not casual Friday, she said, waving a hand at my perfectly fine sweater and jeans. I bit my tongue and headed for the garage, but not before overhearing my older brother Mark talking to my dad in the next room. Emily should help out more. I mean, she doesn't have a family to support, and I'm drowning over here, Mark was saying. My dad grunted in response, which could have meant anything, but it was enough to make my blood boil. Mark had borrowed money from me 3 times in the past 5 years and hadn't paid back a cent. Now he was angling for more? By the time dinner rolled around, I was already on edge. I sat at the far end of the table, hoping to avoid direct fire, but the hits kept coming. Aunt Sarah cornered me about my lack of direction in life. Uncle Tom made another crack about my weight, this time comparing me to my cousin Jessica, who still runs marathons. My dad nodded along as if these comments were perfectly reasonable. Then there was my mom. Oh, Julia. She knew about my dietary restrictions. We talked about it weeks ago. I can't eat gluten. It's not a fad or a preference. It's a medical issue. But there it was, a steaming plate of stuffing plopped right in front of me. Mom, I can't eat this, I said, trying to keep my tone neutral. It's just a little bread, Emily. Stop being so dramatic, she replied, rolling her eyes. Actually, it's not just a little bread. It's gluten, and it'll make me sick, I said, louder this time. The table went quiet, all eyes on me. Oh, for heaven's sake, she muttered, turning her attention back to her plate. That was it. The final straw. Without a word, I stood up, grabbed my coat, and walked out. The cold November air hit me like a slap, but it was better than staying in that house 1 second long. I didn't even make it home before my phone started buzzing nonstop. Notifications lit up the screen on the passenger seat as I drove through the dark, quiet streets. My stomach churned every time the phone vibrated. It wasn't hard to guess who was messaging me. By the time I reached my apartment and parked, there were already a dozen missed calls and messages waiting for me. The first one I opened was from my mom. It was long, filled with accusations and disappointment. She seemed more upset about the embarrassment I'd caused her than about how I felt or why I had left. There was no acknowledgement of the constant judgment or the fact that my dietary needs had been blatantly ignored. Instead, She wrote about how I'd ruined the evening and caused her unnecessary stress. Other messages quickly followed. My older brother Mark had written paragraphs about family loyalty, implying that I had betrayed them all by leaving. He brought up unrelated past grievances and hinted that my actions had embarrassed him in front of his wife and children. Aunt Sarah had also chimed in, her message short but cutting. Her words felt more like a personal attack than a genuine concern for what had happened. The flood of messages didn't stop there. My phone continued to buzz, vibrating incessantly as notifications poured in from different family members. Even cousins I hadn't spoken to in months felt the need to weigh in. I tried to ignore it at first, hoping the barrage would eventually slow down, but it didn't. I turned my phone to silent, but the messages still felt loud in my head. When I finally opened my email the next morning, the drama had spilled over there, too. My mom had sent a long email detailing all the ways she had sacrificed for me over the years and accusing me of being ungrateful. She described the hurt and embarrassment she felt after my departure and insisted I owed the family an apology. Other relatives had sent emails as well, their messages just as critical and relentless. The sense of guilt began to weigh on me, but it was mixed with anger. I knew why I had left. I knew I wasn't wrong for finally standing up for myself, but their words made me question everything. I started feeling isolated, trapped by their expectations and judgments. By mid-afternoon, the stress became too much. I went through my phone and began blocking numbers, one by one. First my mom, then Mark, then Aunt Sarah. I even blocked a few cousins who had sent particularly hurtful messages. It wasn't an easy decision, but I couldn't handle the onslaught any longer. I needed space to think clearly and protect myself from their constant criticism. Later that day, I reached out to my therapist, Dr. Rachel. I recounted everything: the toxic dinner, the guilt-ridden messages, and the overwhelming sense of betrayal I felt from my family. She listened patiently, then reminded me of something we discussed before. Setting boundaries wasn't selfish. It was necessary for my mental health. They're reacting this way because they're not used to you standing up for yourself, Dr. Rachel explained. It's not about you being wrong. It's about them not knowing how to handle the change. Blocking their messages is a way to protect yourself. It's not cruel. It's self-care. Her words helped me breathe a little easier. I spent the rest of the evening focusing on myself, trying to decompress after the chaos. I didn't check my phone again that night, and for the first time in hours, I felt a small sense of peace. I thought blocking their numbers would bring peace. For a day or two, it did. My phone stopped vibrating, and I allowed myself to relax, even finding moments of relief. But the silence was short-lived. It wasn't long before the backlash spilled out of private messages and into the public eye. It started with a text from my best friend, Amanda. She sent me a screenshot of a Facebook post. My stomach dropped when I saw the header: Family and the Importance of Tradition. The author? My mother, Julia. The post wasn't long, but it was packed with guilt-inducing accusations. She wrote about how certain people forget the sacrifices others make to bring everyone together. She mentioned how she'd spent days cooking and preparing, only to be abandoned at the table. She didn't name me outright, but anyone who knew our family could piece it together. Amanda messaged me again. She's talking about you, right? Are you okay? I wasn't okay. I felt exposed. My family had taken a private dispute and broadcast it for the world to see. But it didn't stop there. My sister, Rebecca, took things a step further. Rebecca was always dramatic. Growing up, she loved playing the victim, and now, as an adult, she used social media as her stage. Within hours of my mom's post, Rebecca had shared her own. This one was far more pointed. She wrote, "Betrayal doesn't always come from strangers. Sometimes it's the people you trust most who hurt you the worst. Disloyalty is a choice, and some people choose it over and over again." Unlike my mom, Rebecca didn't shy away from names. She tagged me. When I saw the notification, I froze. I hadn't spoken to Rebecca in months. She wasn't even at Thanksgiving. But there she was, weaponizing the situation for her own gain. The comments on both posts were relentless. People who barely knew me chimed in with their opinions. Some called me ungrateful. Others speculated about what I'd done to deserve being labeled a traitor by my own family. I wanted to respond, to defend myself, but what could I say? It felt like I was shouting into a void, and every word I said would only add fuel to the fire. Instead, I deactivated my Facebook account, hoping it would at least shield me from the barrage. But social media wasn't the only battlefield. Within days, the rumors began to trickle into my real life. It started with small things: acquaintances suddenly ignoring my messages, coworkers giving me odd looks during lunch breaks. One day, I ran into a neighbor, Mrs. Higgins, at the grocery store. She'd always been friendly, always ready to chat about her garden or the latest neighborhood gossip. But this time, she was different. Her smile was tight, her voice clipped. "I heard there was some trouble over the holidays," she said, eyeing me carefully. "Trouble?" I asked, feigning ignorance. "With your family. Julia mentioned it at book club." She paused, clearly fishing for details. "Family's so important, you know, especially during the holidays." I didn't respond. What could I say? That my own mother was bad-mouthing me to her friends? I mumbled something about being in a rush and hurried away. At work, things became even more uncomfortable. One of my coworkers, Angela, had known my mom for years. They went to the same church. I didn't think much of it until Angela stopped inviting me to lunch. She didn't say anything outright, but her coldness was unmistakable. It didn't take long for me to realize she'd been talking to my mom. The isolation was suffocating. Everywhere I turned, it felt like someone was judging me, their opinions shaped by half-truths and exaggerations spread by my family. I started second-guessing everything: how I dressed, how I spoke, even how I carried myself in public. I felt like a pariah, and the worst part was, I couldn't do anything about it. Despite the chaos, there were a few people who stood by me. Amanda, my best friend, was my rock. She checked in on me daily, reminding me that I wasn't the villain my family made me out to be. Another close friend, Rachel, offered to confront Rebecca on my behalf, though I begged her not to. I didn't want to escalate things any further. Even my therapist, Dr. Rachel, was a source of comfort. During one of our sessions, I broke down, venting about the public fallout and how powerless I felt. "They've turned everyone against me," I said, my voice shaking. "Even people who don't know me are judging me. I feel like I'm drowning." Dr. Rachel nodded thoughtfully. "It's not uncommon for families to react this way when someone challenges their dynamic. Your family is used to having control over you, and now that you've taken that control back, they're lashing out. It's a reflection of their discomfort, not your worth." Her words helped, but only a little. The reality was, I couldn't undo the damage. My family had already painted me as the villain, and no amount of therapy could change how others perceived me. Things reached a breaking point a few weeks later. I was at a local cafe, trying to enjoy a quiet cup of coffee, when I overheard two women talking at the next table. At first, I wasn't paying attention, but then I caught my name. "I can't believe what Emily did," one of them said. "Julia must be heartbroken." "I know," the other replied. "It's so sad." And Rebecca's post: "It really puts things into perspective." I wanted to scream. They didn't know me. They didn't know the full story. Yet here they were, dissecting my life like it was some soap opera for their entertainment. That night, I called Amanda and broke down completely. "I don't know how much more of this I can take," I said, tears streaming down my face. "Everywhere I go, it feels like someone is judging me." "You don't have to face this alone," Amanda replied. "The people who matter know the truth. Let the rest think what they want. It says more about them than it does about you." Her words were comforting, but the wounds were still raw. I spent the next few weeks keeping to myself, avoiding social gatherings, and steering clear of social media. Slowly, the whispers began to fade, and I found a semblance of peace. The decision to cut off my family, at least for the time being, left a gaping hole in my life. For weeks, I wandered through my days feeling unmoored, like I'd lost a part of myself. But eventually, that space started to feel less like emptiness and more like potential. I wasn't tied to their expectations anymore. For the first time in years, I could focus on what I wanted, whatever that even was. It started small. I'd always loved baking, though it had been more of a sporadic hobby than a passion. One night, as I scrolled through local events on my phone, I saw a listing for a beginner's baking class at a nearby culinary studio. I hesitated, feeling a twinge of doubt. Was I really the type of person to join a class full of strangers? But something inside me pushed forward, and before I could overthink it, I'd signed up. The first day of the class, I walked into the studio feeling both nervous and excited. The room smelled of vanilla and butter, a comforting combination that immediately put me at ease. The instructor, Mia, was a cheerful woman in her late 40s with a knack for making everyone feel welcome. She introduced herself, then asked us all to share what had brought us to the class. When it was my turn, I hesitated, not wanting to delve into my family drama in front of strangers. "I've always loved baking," I said simply, "but I've never had the time to really learn." "I figured now's as good a time as any." Mia smiled warmly. "Perfect reason. Let's make sure you leave this class loving it even more." As the weeks went on, I did. Each class felt like a small escape. I learned how to make everything from sourdough bread to intricate tarts. My favorite was the day we tackled croissants, a painstaking process that left me covered in flour but grinning ear to ear. I started experimenting at home, too, filling my apartment with the comforting aroma of freshly baked goods. Through the class, I met Clara and Sophia, two women who quickly became my friends. Clara was a retired schoolteacher with a sharp wit and a penchant for bold fashion choices. Sophia was a graphic designer in her 20s, quiet but endlessly kind. The three of us bonded over our shared love of food and the mutual awkwardness of being surrounded by strangers. "You know," Clara said one evening as we cleaned up after class, "you're not half bad at this. You ever think about opening your own bakery?" I laughed, brushing flour off my hands. "I think I'll leave that to the professionals. For now, I'm just happy not to set anything on fire." But her comment stuck with me. Maybe I wasn't ready to turn baking into a career, but it felt good to have something I was passionate about again. Around the same time, I rediscovered another old love, painting. I hadn't picked up a brush in over a decade, not since college. Back then, I'd painted constantly, portraits, landscapes, abstract pieces, but life had gotten in the way. Between work and family obligations, I'd convinced myself there wasn't time for it anymore. One Saturday, while tidying up my closet, I found an old sketchbook tucked behind a pile of sweaters. Flipping through it was like opening a time capsule. The pages were filled with rough sketches and half-finished ideas, a reminder of the person I used to be. On a whim, I grabbed the sketchbook and a pencil, sat down at my kitchen table, and started drawing. The lines were shaky at first, but soon my hand found its rhythm. By the end of the afternoon, I'd filled an entire page with sketches. The next day, I bought a set of paints and a few canvases. For the first time in years, I felt excited to create something just for myself. Painting became my refuge. After long days at work, I'd come home, put on some music, and lose myself in the colors and shapes. My apartment slowly filled with finished canvases, each one a little better than the last. Clara and Sophia became my biggest cheerleaders, encouraging me to show my work at a local art fair. "Are you kidding?" I said when Clara first suggested it. "I'm not good enough for that." "Bullshit," she replied. "You've got talent, and more importantly, you've got something to say. People will love it." To my surprise, they did. I signed up for a small booth at the fair, expecting nothing more than polite smiles and a few curious glances. Instead, I sold 3 paintings within the first hour. A woman named Deborah, who ran a gallery downtown, stopped by my booth and asked if I'd ever considered displaying my work in a professional setting. I nearly dropped my coffee in shock. As my confidence grew, so did my career. At work, I'd always been diligent but hesitant to take risks. Without the constant stress of my family weighing me down, I found myself taking on new challenges. I pitched ideas, collaborated with colleagues, and even led a successful campaign for a major client. 6 months later, my boss called me into her office and offered me a promotion. I was stunned. "You've been doing incredible work," she said. "It's time we recognize that." The promotion came with a pay raise and more responsibility, but it also brought a sense of validation I hadn't felt in years. For the first time, I wasn't just going through the motions, I was thriving. Along the way, I started meeting new people. The art fair introduced me to a community of creatives who shared my passion for self-expression. I struck up a friendship with Deborah, who invited me to gallery openings and introduced me to other artists. At one event, I met Alex, a photographer with a dry sense of humor and a knack for capturing the beauty in everyday moments. We quickly hit it off, bonding over our shared love of bold coffee and late-night brainstorming sessions. I also began exploring the city more. On weekends, I'd visit farmers markets and local fairs, chatting with vendors and sampling their goods. At one market, I met Lily, a beekeeper who sold jars of honey infused with lavender and cinnamon. She invited me to visit her apiary, and before I knew it, I was donning a beekeeper suit and learning about the intricacies of hive maintenance. It was nothing like the life I'd known before, but it felt right. The more I invested in myself, the more my world expanded. I wasn't just rebuilding my life. I was creating something entirely new. It wasn't easy, and there were still days when I missed my family, despite everything. But for the first time in a long time, I felt free. 2 months had passed since Thanksgiving, and my life had finally started to feel normal again. The noise from my family had quieted. I was thriving in my career, reconnecting with old passions, and surrounding myself with people who genuinely supported me. But just as I began to settle into this new chapter, an unexpected letter arrived. It was a Saturday morning, and I was enjoying a cup of coffee at my kitchen table when I noticed the envelope tucked among a pile of junk mail. The handwriting on the front stopped me cold. It was my mother's. For a moment, I debated throwing it away. The thought of opening it felt like reopening a wound I'd worked so hard to heal. But curiosity won out. The letter began with an apology, though I read the first few lines with skepticism. After all, my mother was an expert at turning apologies into guilt trips. But as I read further, something about her tone felt different. She wasn't just blaming me or making excuses. She was confessing. She admitted to being manipulative, something I never thought I'd hear from her. "I've spent so many years trying to control everything," she wrote, "including you. I see now how much damage I've done, and I'm so sorry. You deserved better from me." I read those words over and over, unsure whether to feel relief or anger. Part of me wanted to believe her, but the other part couldn't forget how many times she'd hurt me in the past. She went on to say that my father, Harold, had also written me a letter, and they hoped I would read both. Sure enough, my dad's letter was in the same envelope. His tone was more awkward, but no less surprising. My father had always been passive, the type to avoid confrontation at all costs. He admitted as much in the letter, writing, "I let too many things slide. I should have stepped in when things got out of hand, but I didn't. I regret not being there for you in the ways you needed." He also apologized for enabling my mother's behavior, a statement that hit me harder than I expected. I'd spent years resenting my father for standing by silently while my mom and siblings picked me apart. Hearing him acknowledge his role in it felt like a step toward closure, though I wasn't sure if it was enough. The next day, 2 more letters arrived, this time from my brother Mark and my sister Rebecca. I almost laughed when I saw their names on the envelopes. Mark had always been self-serving, and Rebecca lived for drama. I couldn't imagine either of them offering a genuine apology. I started with Mark's letter. It was short, barely half a page, and filled with cliches. He apologized for not always being the best brother and admitted that he'd taken advantage of me financially. But his tone felt detached, as if someone had told him to write it rather than him doing it from the heart. He ended the letter by suggesting we attend therapy as a family, which struck me as more of a formality than a real desire to fix things. Rebecca's letter was even shorter. She claimed she regretted her social media posts and apologized if they had hurt me. That word stuck in my throat like a thorn. Her entire apology felt like an afterthought, an obligatory gesture rather than a meaningful one. She, too, mentioned therapy, though her tone made it clear she wasn't taking it seriously. I set the letters aside and stared out the window, my emotions swirling. Part of me wanted to believe that my family was genuinely trying to make amends, but I couldn't ignore how surface-level Mark and Rebecca's apologies felt, or how years of damage couldn't be undone with a few paragraphs of regret. The following week, I received another letter, this time from my cousin Jessica. I hadn't spoken to her since Thanksgiving, and seeing her name on the envelope filled me with dread. I expected more criticism or passive-aggressive remarks, but instead, her letter surprised me. Jessica admitted that she'd been wrong to judge me so harshly. "I didn't understand what you were going through," she wrote, "and I made assumptions without knowing the full story. I'm sorry for contributing to the toxicity." Unlike Mark and Rebecca, her words felt sincere. She even mentioned that she'd started going to therapy herself, inspired by the boundaries I'd set. It was the first time I felt a flicker of hope that maybe some relationships could be salvaged. Despite the letters, I hesitated to respond. I wasn't ready to dive back into the chaos of my family, especially not after finding so much peace in their absence. But the idea of therapy lingered in my mind. Maybe it wasn't about fixing the relationships. I wasn't sure that was even possible, but about finding a way to coexist without falling back into old patterns. After a long talk with my therapist, I decided to respond to my parents' letters. I wrote to them separately, acknowledging their apologies but setting firm boundaries. I made it clear that while I appreciated their efforts, rebuilding trust would take time and consistency. I also told them that if they were serious about therapy, I would consider attending, but only if it was a neutral setting with a professional who wasn't tied to our family. I didn't respond to Mark and Rebecca right away. Their letters felt too hollow to warrant a reply. Instead, I focused on what I needed: space, clarity, and time to heal. A few weeks later, my parents followed up with a phone call. For the first time in years, they didn't pressure me or try to guilt me into anything. They simply thanked me for my letter and said they'd started looking into family therapists. My dad even admitted that he was nervous but willing to try, which was more than I ever expected from him. Rebecca, on the other hand, continued to post vague comments on social media, hinting at family drama without naming names. It was frustrating, but I refused to engage. Mark texted me a few times, his messages alternating between casual updates and not-so-subtle reminders about therapy. I didn't respond, unsure whether his intentions were genuine or self-serving. Over time, the letters and phone calls became less frequent, but the door to reconciliation remained slightly open. I didn't know what the future held for my relationships with my family, but for the first time, I felt like I was in control of the narrative. I wasn't the scapegoat anymore. I was simply Emily, living my life on my own terms, no longer defined by their expectations or manipulations. I had mixed feelings when the day of the therapy session finally arrived. It had taken weeks to coordinate: a neutral setting, a therapist unaffiliated with anyone in the family, and schedules that worked for everyone. I agreed to it not because I was convinced it would fix anything, but because I needed closure. After years of unspoken resentments and unhealthy dynamics, this was a chance to say my piece in a controlled environment. The therapist, Dr. Monroe, was a calm, no-nonsense woman in her 50s. She had a soothing voice but didn't shy away from asking hard questions. The session was held in a spacious, neutral office with comfortable chairs arranged in a circle. No one could claim the high ground here. Every seat was equal, and every person would be heard. When I walked in, my parents were already there, sitting stiffly next to each other. My mom was nervously twisting a handkerchief in her lap, while my dad stared at the floor, avoiding eye contact. Mark arrived next, his expression unreadable, followed closely by Rebecca, who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. The tension in the room was palpable, and for a moment, I wondered if I'd made a mistake. Dr. Monroe started by laying out the ground rules. "This is a safe space," she said, her voice steady. "Everyone will have a chance to speak without interruption. This isn't about placing blame. It's about understanding each other and moving forward in a healthier way." She turned to me first. "Emily, since you're the one who initiated this meeting, would you like to start?" I hesitated, my palms sweaty. "I agreed to this because I need clarity," I said, keeping my voice as steady as I could. "For years, I felt like I was walking on eggshells around all of you. I felt judged, dismissed, and, frankly, used. I can't go back to that dynamic. If we're going to have any kind of relationship, things need to change." My mom let out a shaky breath, and Dr. Monroe turned to her. "Julia, how do you respond to what Emily has shared?" There was a long pause before my mom finally spoke. Her voice was quiet, almost fragile. I think she's right," she admitted, her eyes brimming with tears. "I've been so focused on keeping up appearances, on making sure everyone sees us as a perfect family, that I didn't realize how much pressure I was putting on Emily. I thought if everything looked fine on the outside, it would fix whatever was broken on the inside. Hearing her admit that felt like a small weight lifting off my chest. For years, I'd felt like I was fighting a losing battle against her expectations, and now, for the first time, she was acknowledging it. Dr. Monroe nodded and turned to my dad. Harold, what about you? How do you see your role in all of this? My dad shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. I think I let things slide for too long, he said, his voice low. I thought if I stayed quiet, the conflicts would work themselves out. I didn't want to pick sides, but in doing that, I ended up making things worse. I should have stepped in, should have been a buffer instead of letting it all build up. His words hit me harder than I expected. My dad had always been the quiet one, the peacemaker, but his silence had often felt like abandonment. Hearing him admit that made me feel both vindicated and sad. Next, Dr. Monroe turned to Mark. Mark, what would you like to say to Emily? Mark looked uncomfortable, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. I guess. I always thought Emily could handle it, he said, avoiding my gaze. She's always been the responsible one, the one who gets things done. I didn't realize how much I was dumping on her. I just assumed she'd be fine because she always seemed fine. I let out a bitter laugh before I could stop myself. Seeming fine and being fine are two very different things, Mark. Dr. Monroe gently intervened. Emily, let him finish, and then you'll have a chance to respond. Mark sighed. I know I've taken advantage of you. Borrowing money, expecting you to help with my messes. I see now how unfair that was. I'm sorry for putting so much on your shoulders. His apology felt rehearsed, but at least he was admitting to something. Whether he truly meant it was another matter. Finally, Dr. Monroe turned to Rebecca, who had been sitting silently with her arms crossed. Rebecca, do you have anything you'd like to say? Rebecca shifted uncomfortably, her gaze darting around the room. I guess I'm sorry for posting about you online, she muttered, barely above a whisper. It wasn't fair. I was upset, and I took it out on you. I shouldn't have done that. Her apology felt as superficial as her letter, but I nodded anyway, more for the sake of moving on than anything else. Dr. Monroe gave me the floor again. Emily, this is your opportunity to set boundaries moving forward. What do you need from your family to feel safe in these relationships? I took a deep breath, steadying myself. First, I need honesty. No more pretending everything is fine when it's not. If there's an issue, talk to me about it directly instead of gossiping or making passive-aggressive comments. My mom nodded, her face flushed with guilt. Second, I need respect for my boundaries, I continued. That means no prying into my personal life, no unsolicited advice about my choices, and no expectations that I'll drop everything to fix someone else's problems. I'm not a bank, and I'm not a doormat. Mark looked down at his hands, and Rebecca rolled her eyes, but neither of them argued. Lastly, I need to feel like I'm part of the family, not the black sheep, I said. That means treating me with the same kindness and consideration you'd show anyone else. I'm done being the scapegoat. The room was silent for a moment, and then Dr. Monroe spoke. Those are clear and reasonable boundaries, Emily. Julia, Harold, Mark, Rebecca, how do you feel about them? My mom nodded tearfully. I'll do whatever it takes, she said. I don't want to lose you. My dad murmured his agreement, though he looked less certain. Mark gave a half-hearted shrug, while Rebecca barely acknowledged the question. It was clear that some of them were more willing to change than others, but at least the expectations were on the table. As the session wrapped up, Dr. Monroe encouraged us to keep communicating and to consider additional sessions if necessary. I left the office feeling both lighter and heavier. Lighter because I'd finally said what I needed to say, and heavier because I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Rebuilding trust would take time, if it happened at all. But for the first time, I felt like I was in control of my own story. Whether my family chose to meet me halfway was up to them. All I could do was hold firm to my boundaries and keep moving forward. Leaving the therapy session felt like walking out of a storm. I had finally said my piece, drawn my lines, and watched as my family reacted in their own ways. Some with genuine understanding, others with indifference or vague compliance. But for the first time, I wasn't looking back. This wasn't about their feelings or their expectations anymore. It was about me, and that realization was both terrifying and liberating.